We did just announce that plenary is beginning, and I know people will be coming over soon. But to try to keep on time today so everything else doesn't get delayed, we are going to begin. Okay, and okay. Well, we had an introductory slide for you, but we'll forget that. So it's my pleasure to introduce a very close colleague of mine and friend, Raj Sampath. Raj is the associate professor here at Brandeis of the philosophy of justice, rights, and social change. And he also serves as our lead investigator on social exclusion at our research center, at our Center for Global Development and Sustainability. Raj has a very distinguished background as a philosopher, and he's moved into issues of ethics and human rights, of course, very, very powerfully. And his early training in philosophy was, of course, in continental philosophy, and the number of continents for which he is now fully, versed and writing proficiently has expanded to many other continents of the world, particularly, of course, Asia, and specifically South Asia. So, Raj, may I introduce you, please? Thank you.
Well, thank you for being here. I know we're a small group, so if people come in, that's fine too. So I would rather do a very short presentation so we can have a discussion. We have no time for this. I want to hear from your perspective. But before I do so, I want to thank Professor Lawrence Simon and Professor Thorat here because they are the two founding visionaries to bring attention to Ambedkar, I think, here in the United States in recent memory. If I'm not mistaken, Columbia has a history, obviously because Ambedkar studied at Columbia University. But to have a whole conference of academics, practitioners, policymakers, activists, heads of NGOs, this began in 2015, and there have been 3 conferences at Brandeis, one at the New School, one at the University of Massachusetts, and now after COVID, we were delayed. The conference is back here at Brandeis. So we have Professor Simon to thank for his entrepreneurship and his vision. Okay, so today I want to talk about my work in the last few years has really brought my own perspective as first or second generation, whatever you want to say, but a person raised from infancy as a person of color of South Asian descent, and in that South Indian descent, my parents immigrated here, and they brought me when I was a baby. But in the United States, we're oftentimes, from a very early stage in our life, brought up into the conversation of race and racism. So over time as a scholar, obviously I had to become equipped with the American context, the Western context, broadly speaking, about constitutional frameworks on race and racism. It really wasn't until the 2012s, 13, 15, when I had to rediscover my own South Asian ancestry, because as you may know, when your parents immigrate, they may not discuss caste. They create cross-caste solidarity, even between lower caste and Brahmins, because they're sharing in the immigrant experience to fight the racism and the xenophobia that immigrants typically face. So you grow up in a caste-blind kind of system. But it was truly meeting Dalit students. A few years into my professorship, they would come and I naively would say, oh, caste doesn't exist. Oh, caste system, it's dead. And then the Indian students would teach me, like, what? No. What do you? It's very much alive. And that to me was the awakening. And I've been on this journey to try to not conflate the history of racism rooted in slavery, the genocide of indigenous peoples, colonization, which you all know in terms of the post-colonial context, and the long enduring history of caste as a phenomenon that descends from antiquity. In particular, we heard from Dr. Thorat's discussion this morning about the history of caste as a concept from the Hindu Vedic age, then Buddhism in this very brief period with Buddhism, but then the counter-revolution, the destruction of that Buddhist heritage and the appropriation of it, and then through the medieval period, the Mughal period, Muslim, and then the British colonial period. So caste and race is what we're going to talk about But we can't conflate the two, and yet they have some strange resemblances. That's what we have to explore today. Okay, I won't read through my abstract, which is what I submitted to Professor Simon for what the talk is about. I'll just go right to what I was just posing as my question. Why do we have to think about these together? You know, you think race and racism in the West, the legacy of colonization of the global South. And when I say West, I mean, you know, Western Europe, Scandinavia to a lesser extent, but these days they have their own issues. The UK, of course, and then North America. Australia and New Zealand is part of the Commonwealth, but the West. So yeah, it has its own history, and that you can have a whole conference just to focus on that. Caste and casteism we think is South Asia, particularly India, but throughout South Asia. There are caste atrocities and documentation in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, pre-colonial, colonial, post-colonial manifestations. My view is that we need people who focus on theoretical description, theoretical innovation, to start to talk about these categories in ways that don't conflate them, but, you know, maintain their differences, historical differences, but how do we bring them into dialogue? This is what I see today. I think we all see it. It doesn't matter where you are in our globalized world. When I say crosswise, I mean like an X. Caste and caste discrimination exists in the West. That's what the anti-discrimination policies have been about. Brandeis was the first, but many other universities, Seattle City Council, the work of Sanjay and the Boston Study Group, AIM. So we're talking about the caste phenomenon, yes, of course, in South Asia, but the anti-discrimination policies today. But then I was telling Mark that recently Amnesty International hired me to do a piece on South Asia, and you would think it was about caste, or perhaps the ID vices and the tribal and the indigenous questions, or the Assam border and the Naxalites. They said, let's talk about race and racism. I said, oh, okay, you want me to talk about race and racism in the West? They said, no, we have to conceptualize together ways to understand the promulgation of racist systems and internal colonial systems in a place like India, not towards other Indians across the caste system, but think about the Asian border, the Assam people, or the treatment of black people, or the very complex question of colorism, the commodification of fair skin and whiteness that cuts across caste in many complex ways. So in other words, racism in the non-Western, meaning in the absence of white majorities, which is the history of white supremacy, in global South and Eastern contexts, in the absence of white majorities. Okay, I guess maybe we don't need to, I think I can just get rid of this little square box here. Where did this go? This way we can see my PowerPoint. Okay. A quick immersion. I'm not a constitutional legal scholar. My PhD is in the humanities. So I apologize for those of you that have the legal background. You can clarify my own knowledge. But in our 13th Amendment, the United States, right after the Civil War, banned slavery, involuntary servitude, but look at this, except as punishment for crimes. So today scholars talk about the school to prison pipeline, or prisons, particularly for black people and Latinx, as a type of servitude. It's obviously involuntary, but it's justified by the state and the law because it's a punishment for crimes. This is key because, and Dr. Thorad elucidated to this, and other folks mentioned that, at least in the Indian Constitution, you have a provision for affirmative action. But what do we have here in the United States? No state laws can be passed to infringe on the privileges and immunities of citizens in the Union. So broadly speaking, there is a national priority as to what a universal right could look like, and no state can come along and try to, violate what would be a nationally recognized right. But this is what most people focus on, the 2 and 3, the equal protection. The law must be equally applied to all citizens, and therefore duties must be upheld to protect some groups from being violated by the majority. So the protection of minority rights in particular. Equal rights for all peoples, not just for some. Privacy clause and the liberty interest, another portion of this all-important amendment, which, by the way, is the basis for a lot of the advancement of a lot of our civil rights movements. For example, the legalization of gay marriage. Privacy clause and the liberty interest. No state can deprive a citizen of life, liberty, or property without due process of the law. It can't be arbitrary. You can't just arbitrarily single people out and start to deprive them of certain basic rights. If states do intervene in the privacy of the interests, in privacy interests of citizens, they must be restricted when they try to attempt to intervene in the privacy interests of citizens. For example, intermarriage. That's a private decision between two individuals. The state can't impose some kind of racial doctrine that prevents people from marrying because they come from two different racial groups. Think about caste atrocities now. I'm talking about race here, but try to keep it in the back of your mind. Caste in the South Asian context, intercaste marriage. Okay. Huge amendment. 15th, right to vote. So black people freed from slavery, now the right to vote, not to be infringed. But look at this, no discrimination based on race, color, or any previous condition of servitude. So, we can talk about some basic amendments here in the U.S. Constitution that's supposed to attend to the problem of slavery, its legacy, and now no discrimination on the basis of race, therefore no racism in the system, you would think. But after slavery and after legalized segregation in America, Plessy versus Ferguson, if I get my dates right, 1896 to 1954, Brown v. Board, desegregation. Think about that long period of legalized structured apartheid, condoned by the state, not condoned, enforced by the state, but the state that has no duty to protect black people from the everyday terror they faced from a white majority that can act with impunity. And then the genius of the civil rights movements from the 50s and 60s, but as early as the early 70s, black scholars who were the minority then, minority now, but minority then, said, well, wait a minute. Before we can even try to articulate a post-civil rights era, we overcame the segregation. We launched the civil rights movements that led to the civil rights legislation. But how is that whole effort slowly being attacked and eroded and destroyed? And that's how the story begins. These are some of the principal figures. I could name many across different generations if I had the time. But some of the principal architects, the real forerunner, Derek Bell, early 70s, first textbook, if I'm not mistaken, in American law schools on race, racism, the American law, but Kimberly Crenshaw, principal figure in the late 80s. Charles Lawrence III, Richard Delgado, comes from a Latino background, but part of a predominantly black group of scholars that launched the critical race theory movement. That's what that's supposed to say in that top slide, the dawn of the critical race theory in the post-civil rights era of the United States. Okay, well, what are some of the major concepts as far as I understand them? And I know I'm in the presence of legal scholars, so I humbly ask that you indulge me as a non-legal scholar that I'm getting this right. Bell's convergence interest, but the convergence interest of not only black civil rights, the fight for black civil rights with regard to the white legislature to meet at a certain point where it's in the interest of everyone to advance the civil right. But the underbelly of that, the other side, the opposite side is, the possibility to advance, people of color to advance their cause requires, in many respects, a convergence of the white establishment with their own interests. There's a preservation of their own interests, even as you move to a more diversified society. It's not enough for the law to focus on individual acts of discrimination. I'll jump to the third point, but it kind of brings up the other 2 points, structural materialism. But you can focus on individual acts of discrimination and say, hey, this person of a certain race is being discriminated against, let's say by a white employer. I can prove it. There's intent. There's evidence. There's a trail to show in that act that a discrimination occurred. It violates some law and therefore needs to be addressed. But we got to move away from just the focus on individual acts to the actual structures of society. That even as we advance in the law, principles of justice, and the legislatures produce new laws to protect people, Why is there still a material story of oppression, disparities, widening gaps and inequalities? What's the material realm of the oppression, even if the law is advancing to a more inclusive and diverse sort of structure? How about this? Racism, not just some occasional incident or someone saying a racial slur, or you see a politician who may rise and start spewing some ideas that are inherently racist. It's everyday, it's normal, it's down to the microscopic details. It's baked into all of our institutions. American demographic diversity, but who holds the most power in society? Yeah, we have a demographic diversity. Majority, they say minority. Certainly by 2040, the whole country. But I can tell you, people under the age of 35, that's inclusive of several generations now, because the new ones are emerging. Millennials, younger millennials, Generation Z, Alpha are the young people, and then in 2027, a new one they're going to start to name, Generation B, will be coming out. So there's a demographic diversity, but let's think about who controls all the levers of power in corporations, entrepreneurial wealth, inherited wealth, class, media, academia, government, and the law. Here are some of the numbers. So those of you that may let's try to get a sense of what the latest Bureau says. Non-Latinx whites, so not from Latin America, of European descent, 58% of the country. People from Latin America, 19%, Black, 13.6%, Asian American, 6.3%, Native American, multiracial. Trump in 2020 got 58% of the non-Latinx white vote. Look at this, 36% of Asian American vote, but only 12% of the Black vote, 33% of the Latinx. I would be skewered by social scientists if I made this leap in causality or correlation to the future that, majority minority country, but potentially, this is my claim, this is what I see as a pessimistic person, a potentially legally protected apartheid state in the political economy. In other words, diversity doesn't lead to equality and justice. Hence the radical proposal by someone now, Crenshaw, who began her work in the late 80s, and probably the foremost figure in legal feminism of her generation, Catherine McKinnon. This is a 2019 piece saying, we're living in desperate times. How about proposing a brand new amendment to the Constitution? 2019. And you say, well, they're not serious. Well, of course they're serious. I want to read a little bit of their text. What are they proposing? This is radical proposal that because we can't trust that something like racial progress and equality is inevitable, given all the previous attempts to, bring justice, greater justice to our most basic questions and issues. Take the right to life, the right not to be shot when you're unarmed by the police. So I'll read the text here. Whereas women, this is the amendment itself, it's a long essay, but this is what they finally crystallize. All women and men of color were historically excluded as equals, intentionally and functionally from the Constitution of the United States, subordinating these groups structurally and systematically, whereas prior constitutional amendments have allowed remember we started with the 13th to the 15th, all the way up to the constitutional decisions about segregation and desegregation, the advancement of civil rights, whereas prior to constitutional amendments have allowed extreme inequalities of race and sex or like grounds of subordination to continue without effective legal remedy and have been used to entrench such inequalities. And whereas this country aspires to be a democracy of, by, and for all of its people and to treat all people of the world in accordance with human rights principles, women in all their diversity, therefore it will be enacted, women in all their diversity shall have equal rights. Is that the case? Can we prove that empirically? Equality of rights shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex, pregnancy, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity, or race, ethnicity, national origin, or color, or like grounds, disability, and faith. 3, to fully realize the rights guaranteed under this amendment, Congress and the several states shall take legislative and other measures to prevent or redress any disadvantage suffered by individuals and groups because of past and present inequality, not just present, but past, as prohibited by this amendment. States shall take take steps requisite and effective to abolish prior laws, policies, or constitutional provisions that impede equal protection. Okay. Now this is a sort of an abrupt transition. I have to just, as I move away from the law and come back to a major framework in terms of philosophical theories of justice, a very influential figure, his work in 1971. But to summarize the first section of the talk, and the second half will be on caste and the legacy of Ambedkar, to honor the theme of this conference. What's the takeaway from critical race theory and race as we then move to the discussion of caste and perhaps a critical caste theory? That one's trust in the legal system, as paradoxical as this sounds, is insufficient to advance justice. Well, who else are we going to turn to if we're going to fight for justice? You turn to the law. What are you going to do? Where are you going to go? But that's the structural contradiction, because it's coming from the peoples who are oppressed, articulating their experiences with regard to the legal system. And so it'll be nice to have a conversation with you about the South Asian context, or even if we talk about anti-caste discrimination policies here, the limits of the law to handle, general social transformation. It's an inherently conservative, for reasons that we can't get into, institution, and philosophically, what's the nature of the law that has this inherent kind of, when I say conservatism, but resistant to radical self-critique. Rawls, who has been influential, at least from the philosophical perspective about theories of justice, is going against a very old tradition in the Anglo-American world, the West in general, which is utilitarianism. And simply put, utilitarianism is, very simply put, the greatest good, whatever that means, for the greatest number of people in a system. So people have desires where they want to consume something, some kind of utility or resource. They consume it. It satisfies their mental happiness. We can judge them as happy. Their well-being has been achieved. You count 310 million people in the United States. If all 300 million people are satisfying their needs, propagating the good of how the whole feels, and we're moving to a greater state of justice. And that's still the sort of dominant conception of how most people think. How do we measure the GDP, for example? Rawls comes along and says, wait a minute, no. That's not the only way to think about justice. And his hypothesis is that if you took people of different backgrounds and you covered their faces and their voices and you put them into a room, and this is an experiment, and you said, okay, you all have to come together and think about things that people want in a society, and ways for us to guarantee the fact that people will have the equal opportunity to achieve certain things. You would think, and let's think about this again, keep caste in the background. Okay, political and civil rights. You can't just have political and civil rights for one group. The same political and civil rights that are afforded to one group should be given to all other groups. In capitalist democracies, whether it's the context you come from or Western contexts, we live in capitalist democracies, we live in a global capitalist system, property and resources. But social mobility, the ability to move from one class to another. We want representation in leadership, positions of authority. Number 5 is very elusive. Who gets to define the basis of self-respect? When is there enough justice that you think you've received that an individual or a group can say they truly have achieved self-respect? So his 2 principles are if the group, the anonymous group that meets says, okay, well, we want these things, well, how are we supposed to do our best to guarantee that people have a chance to achieve them? Because there is going to be inequality in a capitalist system. In a democratic system, there should be freedom, an equal opportunity, and an equal right to vote, for example. In principle, doesn't actually occur in reality. Economic inequality can only be justified without compromising the equal opportunity. We should all have that equal opportunity regardless of our background, our inheritance, our tradition, our lineage. No discrimination based on all those categories, race, ethnicity. Today we can talk about disability. Prior to, there are 2 parts to the second principle. I didn't mention the first principle, but that is basic and political civil rights. And this idea of the maximin, maximizing the minimum, Any arrangement that society and economy come up with must accrue benefits to the least advantage. That's understood in terms of class and social expectations for mobility. So least advantage is the people that may have the least expectations to advance from their position to a higher level. We have to attune ourselves to that group. We're going to move to the discussion on Ambedkar, but what was he doing at the very end? Even as he was drafting the Constitution and it was being implemented, we know what this great individual was actually thinking about his own work and what he foresaw as the potential implications for it. It wouldn't be enough to achieve what he wanted, was the true liberation for Dalits and for the lower castes. Okay, here's my transition to the Indian Constitution. Rawls is sort of my bridge. Egalitarian view, if we agree this is what people want, what's the best way to achieve it? But at least in this system, the concern is about the least advantage compared to the utilitarian conception that says, hey, if everyone in the system seems to be consuming things, let's assume everyone's doing well in the system. That's not true. We know that whether it's the Indian context or the US, it's a dire situation. It's a very difficult situation now for the most oppressed groups. The genius of the Indian Constitution. We all know the preamble. We, the people, have solemnly resolved to constitute India into a sovereign democratic republic, secure justice, social, economic, and political, liberty of thought, expression, belief, and faith and worship. All the world religions are present in India, as you know. Muslims, second largest population in the world, I think behind Indonesia. It's not in a GCC or Pakistan or Bangladesh, it's in Equality of status and opportunity. Fraternity, a term that it's missing in our US Constitution, but of course exists in the French. Assuring the dignity of the individual and the unity and the integrity of the nation. But that's where we have to turn to the great figure of Ambedkar in his 20th century context, culminating in being the chairperson of the drafting commission, but the leader of the Dalit liberation movement, the main figure who was debating Gandhi and all the founding figures who were fighting against colonization. He was talking about the internal colonization within Indian society as the whole society was liberating itself from British colonialism. As I tried to interpret the depths of his position, how difficult of a situation someone like him must have been in. That's what we mean by intersectionality. When you're an oppressed person and you're maybe co-opted into the dominant group as the oppressed minority, and yet you're attending to a level of oppression within your own group that others can't see. You're a minority within the minority. He's a minority as a colonial subject, so was Gandhi and everyone else. But within the Indian context, he's a minority because of the Dalit and as the outcast, the untouchability. Minority of the minority. So the Indian Constitution, of course, bans discrimination. That's great, based on caste. But it didn't ban the caste system. 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, we banned discrimination on the basis, but critical race theory, we didn't ban structural racism. There's no legal definition of how to ban structural racism. You cannot say discrimination on the basis of caste. That allows caste to continue. So a statement about banning the caste system itself, which is what he wanted. And I'll try to argue that in a quote that I just discovered from Ambedkar. It's itself, which is a birth-based, as you know, ineradicable hierarchical system. You're assigned the birth, the transmigration of souls that Hindu metaphysics promises, so we can keep climbing up caste or even leave the whole body and achieve this, ahimsa and detachment, the superconsciousness of the Atman and the Brahman. Sure, there's this promise of freedom, but every generation is trapped in this castle of horrors, as Ambedkar says. You're born into this, only one way out is death, and of course the next generation inherits your sins. You're stuck in the system. It does ban untouchability, but we know this. The practice persists in terms of social segregation, discrimination in employment and education, hence the anti-discrimination policies here. Temple worship, exclusion, forbidding intercaste marriage. You see the repercussions of that. Sharing of natural resources, this phenomenon of environmental racism. Who are the most brutally affected by environmental degradation and climate change? everyday brutal violence against Dalits. Sanjay, you gave us an inspirational discussion, I think, a few months ago about the actual atrocities happening today. And tribals for crossing such lines in their attempt to achieve publicly recognizable dignity, equality, and liberty, the Rawlsian basis for self-respect. You all have your summaries of the annihilation of caste, but I want to just enumerate some of its basic principles, and if somebody can keep me on time. Oh, I can see. Larry, you said 2 o'clock, right? I'll wrap up in a few minutes, and then we can have 10 minutes of conversation. Annihilation of caste. Social and cultural change must precede economic and political reform. One of the implications, can religion be reformed to promote equality and liberty while eradicating any feudal vestiges of hierarchy, such as caste? That violates all the Rawlsian principles. What is caste but a mechanism that differentiates laborers within class division while breeding antipathy towards lower and lower castes? It's not enough to talk about class divisions. There are divisions within each class. Excuse me. The power of culture, sacrality, holiness, purity, versus the profane, demonic, and impure. You know this. Post-colonial, legal, secular, constitutional, democratic India is sitting on top of this culture rooted in the caste system based on those ideas. And Dr. Thorat said this morning, the counter-revolution and how aggressive and how militaristic were the times that we're in, the rising Hindu nationalism. Analogously, the rising white nationalism in this country, not just because of the legacy of Trump, but what's going to happen as we go forward into the future. The minoritization of whiteness in this country does not mean white nationalism and white supremacy disappears. Hindu nationalism, tyranny of the majority, violation of minority rights, particularly Muslims and Christians, but of course, cutting across caste. Anyone who questions a majority state ruling party can be subjected to censorship, arrest, and even death by the hands of other public and private groups in which the law turns a blind eye. Separate electoral state and government for Dalit population no longer possible. Remember, Ambedkar debated that. Here's the hardest question. Economic wealth redistribution given the horrendous income inequality in India and other South Asian countries. Okay, my conclusions. Oh, and I want to get to, sorry, I'll do my best, Larry. Conclusion, but this is, I really want to get to this last quote because I'm just blown away by it. Structural racism, I mentioned, is the physical oppression of racialized physical bodies, but it's concealed within law, justice, and democracy. Structural casteism, also physical oppression of physical bodies that are not always racialized. Let's say it's darker skinned peoples, but has this added invisible dimension of the pure and impure souls. It's a social rigid hierarchy. There's only one way in, one way out. While democracy purports to offer equal protection under the law. Fallacious. Critical race theory is trying to shift the exclusive focus from individual acts of discrimination to the actual material functions of the law itself, politics, society, and economy in systemic and structural racism. Critical caste theory can do something similar, systemic structural levels of caste oppression, not just the individual acts of discrimination by a few bad actors. The problem for legal justice is not just the framing of legal arguments to prove something like caste discrimination exists. It's a question of evidence and analysis and proof. Look at the hard work of what CRT scholars have done for now 30 years, documenting how disparities in society, politics, law, culture, and economics are reproduced. For BIPOC, men in general, queer folks, indigenous folks, people with disabilities, documented and undocumented immigrants, is not the same as the most privileged groups in society measured by wealth, power, and ability. Remember that apartheid that I talked about that's emerging, the concentration of political and economic capital in the hands of the few. But similarly, caste functions at the systemic and intergenerational levels of exclusion and oppression if we think of the lower percentage of lower caste, scheduled caste, Dalits in every position. 230 million people, but what representation in all the institutions in society? Brahmins are 3% of the Hindu population, which are 800 million out of the 1.3 billion. Caste is cost-cutting in Christianity and Islam and other religions. But for the most part, that Hindu majority, a very small percentage of higher castes would control the political and economic capital. Now this, to me, I'll conclude here. Very recently, so this was from a 2023 piece from the BBC. I want to quote literally the author of the article in the bold, but then you'll see Ambedkar's quotes within that itself. So we'll highlight Ambedkar's quotes, but let me offer what this particular individual, Sautek Biswas, in his article, B.R. Ambedkar, The Unknown Details of How He Piloted the Indian Constitution. At the end of the first reading of India's constitution on 25 November 1949, Dr. Bhimrao Ambedkar, one of India's greatest statesmen and the undisputed leader of the country's Dalits, formerly called untouchables, delivered a typically prescient speech. This guy's writing in 2023 about this, threshold moment, final reading of the Constitution. On the 26th of January 1950, this is Ambedkar. Look at this. We're going to enter into a life of contradictions. In politics, we'll have equality. And we got equality here since the civil rights movements, right? But we have a very serious problem with inequality and oppression in the United States. Similarly, going back to Ambedkar, in politics, we have equality. But in social and economic life, we'll have inequality. With the Constitution coming into force, India declared itself as a sovereign, democratic republic state that day, the preamble. In his speech, Ambedkar was possibly alluding to the contradictions between a young republic and an old civilization. Democracy is a modern concept. There are ancient forms of it, but we're talking about the modern constitutional form grounded on individual rights. But in the case of India, it's rooted in an old civilization. He said separately, the democracy was only a top dressing. It's just something you put on top of this deeper soil. And the soil is essentially undemocratic. The village is sink of localism, a den of ignorance, narrow-mindedness, and communalism. So I want to pause there because that is the end of my slide. But you might say, oh, what a pessimistic ending, not only for Ambedkar, but what we have to imagine today. He is like a great prophet. He's sitting there in 1950. We're living in 2023. The sink of localism, the den of ignorance, and the narrow-mindedness and the communalism. I invite you now into the conversation to tell me about the threat of right-wing nationalisms, maybe in the hands of the few, the intentional political polarization, the tribalism and normalization of conflict and violence, the extremes that are pushing people to capture more and give less to those that need the most. And this is where I want to end the conversation. Maybe we revisit Ambedkar in 1950, given our conditions today, and we try to ask, well, could he? What would have been the counterfactual? What could have been if Ambedkar achieved his true vision, and we would be in a different situation where he wasn't led to this pessimistic conclusion? And what I argue is that from a constitutional perspective, just like our brave CRT architects trying to propose a new amendment, perhaps we need to propose a new amendment to the Indian Constitution in which the caste system itself, not discrimination on the basis of caste, but the caste system itself has to be eradicated once and for all. Thank you. So, sorry for the abrupt ending with all that passion. I have a lot more to say about this, but yes, please. And then was it? Yeah, thank you. Nice to see you. Nice to see you. Yeah.
I was going to say, when you read that line, the sink of localism, and I was thinking, oh, it's like Fremont California. But I think that's part of what I think is really powerful is that I think a lot of times when we understood what Ambedkar was saying, that people would bring caste wherever they would go, they actually created the politics and the infrastructure of caste in their different diasporic countries. And in the battle in California, what we saw is we have extremely high levels of venture capital and political capital within both parties at the Democratic and Republican level who are interested in preserving Brahmanism at every level of our fight. Yep. So it really requires a different understanding. And I really appreciate that Professor Brown is here too, because his work in relationship to your talk is so critical because when the development of the category of race was really there, the comparisons were caste, were such a deep part of that conversation, which is why we have a unique foundation for caste equity. And I'm sure Professor Brown will go more into it in his talk later today. But to me, the other piece of it for us is that when we use race, critical race theory to understand our experiences of caste oppression, we also have to acknowledge our role as settler colonials and the development of who we are as South Asians. And I think that was one of the unique innovations in California, was the win that we had when Fresno added caste as a protected category. It was done in relationship with Oaxacan indigenous communities.
Okay.
And what they said about the notion of adding caste for them is more in line with our UN understanding of caste. We were talking about global caste systems, discrimination based on work and descent. And the Oaxacan community said, we are against the casta system. And in Los Angeles, they had denigrated Oaxacan members of Los Angeles, saying they were short little brown people who are getting in the way of their political aspirations. So that's why they said they wanted caste as a protected category to look at the hegemonies of white Latinx people, essentially. So I think that in some ways, as we look at that intersection of critical race theory and Ambedkarite practices and political campaigns we're running here, we have a strength in material solidarity with other communities experiencing discrimination based on work and descent. And there's an opening there where it's not critical race theory, critical caste theory, but it's a globalization of our understandings of that. So just wanted to point that for your work. And we'll talk a little bit about it in our panel at 5. But I think that this divide that we've had, especially when we talk about caste only around India, our opponents will not allow us to have that singular frame of South Asia, because they're saying if you do that, they're being racially profiling, they're being targeted, which because of the Cal State stuff. But that's how critical race theory and the language of intersectionality is being weaponized in our battle as well, So there's a lot to kind of unpack with that. And, I really appreciated your talk. And I think that opening is, where we have to put a lot of intentional focus on as scholars. So thank you.
Well, Demozi, but thank you for all your work at Equality Labs and the advocacy that leads to the grassroots movements that leads to the actual change at the legislative levels. It's a tireless type of work. I will say, and thank you, Professor Brown, for being at my talk, but Professor Brooks in an earlier session reminded me of the history that W.B. Bois talked about caste. And then fast forward to more recent times, the paradigm work of Michelle Alexander, the new Jim Crow, the racialized caste system. So there's a long history of the black tradition talking about caste. And of course, Martin Luther King himself going to India and the first discussions. But there's that in Du Bois and Ambedkar. But to your question, Demozi, to your point, being raised in the United States in the West, I'm curious about the UN today, not just on discrimination on the basis of dissent and work. So all the different groups can come together globally and say, what are the shared principles of exclusion that are at work? It could be the Roma in Europe. It could be the Bukharim. You know this. You know the history, Colomburo. Of course, Dalits in the caste system in South Asia. Intergenerational, not trafficking or slavery, but segregated death and burials. And perhaps it spills over into more complicated issues in the African context, witchcraft, albinism. But the point is that the UN still has to isolate, and I'm with this, I'm sorry, the ubiquity of anti-black affect, people of African descent, and what they face. That's what I meant by the racism outside the West. The fact that we're coming to grips, and at least there are the amnesties and others out there on the ground saying there is something like racism, particularly against black people. And you cannot hide behind the post-colonial condition and link everything back to Western colonialism and white supremacy, which is what the great decolonial thinkers of the 20th century did, like Frantz Fanon. So I'm not trying to make this an Olympics of oppression, but I can't conflate the categories. They're in relation to each other, but yet we have this question of racism being global in a way that obviously casteism isn't. And I want to get to that question further without compromising the energy we have right now, as you know, in at least enlightening the West about caste and putting forward anti-caste discrimination. Yes, Professor Brown, please.
Just quickly on this issue of caste and the African American situation. The analogies go all the way back to the 1830s. first anti-discrimination measure that Congress ever passed, Civil Rights Act of 1866, you see several members of Congress saying that the purpose of this is to prevent the replication of a caste system in the U.S. like what exists in South Asia. Mm-hmm. In other words, anti-casteism was at the core core of American anti-discrimination law, which is why, and this is where I want to kind of separate. So this is the point I'm trying to make. If you talk about this in a global context, that means something totally different than talking about this in the context of anti-discrimination law in the United States. Mm-hmm. Because in the context of anti-discrimination law in the United States, there are very strong arguments that caste is in fact a form of race and would be covered by American anti-discrimination laws against race discrimination. I'm almost to the point where I don't even think that's debatable. But when you then globalize it and talk about this is a global issue, that then confuses the whole American legal process, because the whole American legal process is really just about the words that make up our anti-discrimination law, not about this writ large.
This is such a great point, Professor Brown, and this also came up earlier. You're probably being asked to respond to it. I've been asked to respond to it. Themlosy, maybe you as well, but the Harvard case in North Carolina. The insult to injury by the conservative court to say Brown v. Board is the platform we're going to use to depose this.
I understand that.
Diversification.
But if the question is about caste discrimination, the Harvard case helps. Because the Harvard case is saying, look, it's the individual that you're not supposed to discriminate against.
Yep.
So if there's almost an argument here that our concept of race discrimination is anytime you're using ancestry to discriminate against an individual for something that they did not choose, their race, their ethnicity, their national origin. Within the American context, all those concepts conflate into one form of discrimination, and that is discriminating against someone based on ancestry. I mean, I have little doubt that if we had the cases of caste discrimination being pushed in the American legal system, you would find that they would say caste discrimination is already covered by our categories of race discrimination.
That's right. And the need to find the language to show that caste exists in the West and show that within the legal framework so it doesn't get subsumed. It is cross-cutting. It doesn't violate the First Amendment on religion because it cuts across all the religions. It's predominantly, maybe, let's say, in the Hindu majority. Whether it originated in Hinduism or not, the point is that it exists. And that itself is an egregious, affront to our sense of justice. But we have to find the language to continue to elevate, whether it's at the UN and multilateral level, for discrimination on the basis of descent at work, any birth-based assigned hierarchy. But we also cannot lose sight about I have to live in both worlds. I feel like I'm both at the same time. CRT is at an inflection point. I'll leave you with this. I know we're trying to close. But there's a great push. It's the McCarthyism of the 50s back, which, of course, attacks black progress. But to say to Professor Crenshaw, when you see what the GOP and the red states are trying to do, ban CRT in the schools. It's so profoundly un-American. And Crenshaw's brilliant response is like, what are you talking about? It's quintessentially American. It's what grows out of the American experience. You should be proud of the fact that it comes from the American. Meaning the constitutional evolution, but also obviously the struggle of black people, oppressed peoples in general. Okay, well, there's no one here to tell us to end. Does anyone else want to join the conversation? Okay, well, thank you very much. And thank you for attending my talk.